For many viewers around the world, Squid Game looked like an exaggerated dystopia, a fictional island, fictional games, fictional cruelty. But in South Korea, the series triggered a very different reaction. Not because people believed the show was real, but because it reminded them of something that already happened quietly, systematically, and for decades. Long before Squid Game existed, thousands of people in South Korea were removed from public spaces not for committing crimes, but for being poor, homeless, disabled, or simply out of place. According to publicly available records and later investigations, these people were sent to so-called welfare facilities under government programs aimed at social order and urban cleanliness. On paper, these institutions were meant to provide care. In reality, many functioned as closed systems of forced detention. One of the most well-documented examples was Brothers Home, a state-funded welfare center in the city of Busan that operated mainly during the 1970s and 1980s. Survivors later testified that people were taken off the streets by police or facility staff, often without explanation or legal process. Children, adults, people with disabilities, all placed together under strict control. Years later, South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission confirmed that hundreds of deaths occurred inside this single facility. The commission described patterns of forced labor, physical punishment, and systematic abuse. These findings were not rumors or internet theories. They were the result of official investigations based on documents and survivor testimony. Another site, Seonggam Island, operated as a detention center for minors. Former inmates reported being taken there by authorities as children and kept for years. The island's isolation made escape nearly impossible, and according to survivors, attempts to flee were used as warnings to others. This is where Squid Game begins to feel uncomfortably familiar, not in its details but in its logic. In the series, participants are told they chose to be there. In reality, many detainees were told the same thing, that they were being helped, that it was for their own good, that society had no place for them otherwise. The games in Squid Game are framed as voluntary, but economic pressure removes real choice. Similarly, during South Korea's rapid industrialization, poverty itself became a justification for detention. Authorities reportedly used vague vagrancy laws to clear streets before international events and development projects. This context matters. Squid Game was released during a time of rising household debt, job insecurity, and widening inequality in South Korea. Its creator has stated publicly that the story reflects modern economic pressures, not historical institutions. Yet audiences naturally connected the dots. When images circulated online comparing Squid Game sets to old welfare facilities, some turned out to be AI-generated or misidentified. That misinformation spread quickly, but it also revealed something deeper. People were searching for an explanation of why the show felt so real. Because systems that reduce humans to numbers, productivity, or inconvenience do not need fiction to exist. What Squid Game did differently was make that system visible. It stripped away bureaucracy and left only the core question: what happens when survival becomes conditional? Survivors of real institutions have often said that comparing their experiences to a TV show feels inadequate, not because the show is inaccurate, but because fiction can stop. Reality did not. And this raises a crucial question, not about Squid Game itself, but about why its story resonated so strongly. Because if a fictional game show feels believable, the issue may not be the imagination behind it, but the history that made it plausible. In the next part, we'll look at how these institutions were allowed to exist for so long, who benefited from them, and why accountability came decades later. If it came at all, what allowed these institutions to exist was not secrecy alone, but normalization. During South Korea's rapid industrial and economic expansion, order became a national priority. Cities were being rebuilt, international events were approaching, and the country was trying to present itself as modern and disciplined. In that environment, poverty was increasingly treated not as a social issue, but as a disruption. According to official reports and later testimony, police officers were incentivized to detain people labeled as vagrants. Internal evaluation systems reportedly rewarded officers based on the number of people they processed into facilities. This transformed welfare centers into endpoints of enforcement rather than care. Once someone entered these institutions, oversight was minimal and transparency almost non-existent. Many detainees were never formally charged with crimes. Some were picked up while waiting at train stations, walking alone, or simply being outside without clear purpose. Children were not exempt. In some cases, families searched for years without knowing where their relatives had been taken. Inside these facilities, daily life followed strict routines. Survivors have described regimented schedules, compulsory labor, and punishment for minor infractions. Food was limited. Education was inconsistent. Contact with the outside world was rare. Importantly, these accounts come from multiple independent testimonies collected decades apart, often by journalists, human rights groups, and later government bodies. What makes this period particularly difficult to confront is that it did not exist outside the law. These institutions were funded, regulated, and justified through official channels. That meant responsibility was spread across agencies, making accountability harder to establish later. For years, stories from survivors struggled to gain national attention. South Korea in the late 20th century was undergoing political change, and many viewed reopening these cases as destabilizing. Some survivors also remained silent due to stigma, fear, or lack of resources. It wasn't until the 2000s and 2010s that systematic investigations began. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reviewed documents, interviewed survivors, and confirmed patterns of abuse and unlawful detention. Their findings acknowledged state responsibility, but for many victims, recognition came long after the damage was done. This delayed accountability is another point where Squid Game resonates. In the series, the system continues because it operates out of sight and because participants are isolated. In reality, these institutions survived because they were framed as necessary, legal, and beneficial, until scrutiny finally reached them. Importantly, Squid Game does not recreate these events. There are no direct references, no named institutions, no historical reenactments. What it borrows is structure, controlled environments, loss of autonomy, and the idea that human value can be measured through compliance and utility. That is why some Koreans criticized comparisons between the show and real history. Not because the parallels are false, but because entertainment risks simplifying experiences that were deeply complex and painful. Still, the public reaction showed something else. It showed a collective need to revisit stories that had been buried under progress narratives. Squid Game opened a door, even unintentionally, to conversations that had long been postponed. And once that door opened, another question emerged. If this happened before under the label of welfare, could similar systems exist today under different names? In the next part, we'll examine how modern economic pressure, debt culture, and social competition form a different kind of enclosure, one without walls, but with consequences just as real. In today's South Korea, the mechanisms are no longer physical institutions on isolated islands. They are financial, social, and psychological. People are not detained by force, but by obligation. Debt, competition, and survival pressure have replaced guards and locked gates, yet the underlying dynamic remains familiar. South Korea has one of the highest household debt levels among developed economies. For many, borrowing is not a choice but a requirement to study, to start a business, to secure housing. Failure carries long-term consequences, not only financially but socially. This context is critical to understanding why Squid Game's premise felt plausible rather than extreme. In the series, contestants are not forced at gunpoint. They return because the outside world offers no viable alternative. According to social researchers and economists, this mirrors a reality where economic participation is framed as freedom, but exit is not realistically available. This does not mean modern South Korea is repeating the past. The country today has legal protections, public debate, and a functioning civil society. However, systems can still produce harm without explicit cruelty. When success becomes mandatory and failure invisible, people begin to self-police their worth. Squid Game visualizes this pressure by stripping life down to simple rules: win and advance, lose and disappear. In real life, disappearance looks different. It can mean chronic stress, social isolation, or permanent financial marginalization. These outcomes are less visible, but no less impactful. The creator of Squid Game has stated that the show reflects his own experiences with financial insecurity and observation of extreme competition. The games are symbolic, not historical, yet symbolism gains power when it aligns with collective memory. For survivors of past welfare institutions, the discomfort comes from recognition rather than comparison. Not of events, but of logic. Being told your situation is your responsibility. Being offered choice under conditions where refusal carries unbearable cost. This is where the show's global success becomes important. International audiences often interpret Squid Game as a critique of capitalism in general. In South Korea, it is also read as a reflection on national history, one where economic development was prioritized over individual rights. The real tragedy of the historical institutions is not only what happened inside them, but how long they remained invisible. Their existence was normalized through language, paperwork, and distance. They were described as welfare, reform, or protection. Squid Game removes that language. It shows the transaction plainly. Lives are risked for reward. Spectators benefit while remaining detached. The system survives because it is profitable and because participants are isolated from the public. This clarity forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable thought. Systems do not need malicious intent to be destructive. They only need incentives misaligned with human dignity. As conversations around Squid Game continue, some worry that real history may be reduced to background context for entertainment. Others argue that visibility, even through fiction, is better than silence. What is clear is that Squid Game did not invent cruelty. It reframed it in a way that made it harder to ignore. In the final part, we'll look at what accountability means today, why recognition often arrives late, and what lessons remain unresolved, both in South Korea and beyond. Accountability, when it arrives decades later, is rarely complete. For many survivors of South Korea's former welfare institutions, official acknowledgement brought validation but not closure. Investigations confirmed that abuses occurred, that detentions were unlawful, and that the state bore responsibility. Yet consequences for those who designed or enforced these systems were limited, and compensation came slowly, if at all. This gap between recognition and repair is not unique to South Korea. It reflects a broader pattern in how societies process systemic harm. When responsibility is distributed across laws, agencies, and time, it becomes easier to document the past than to correct it. Squid Game ends without offering moral resolution. There is no system-wide reckoning, no clear justice. That absence mirrors reality. The show does not ask who is legally guilty, but why the structure itself was allowed to exist. This may be why the series resonates globally. Every society has mechanisms that sort people by usefulness, productivity, or compliance. Most are subtle, most are legal, and most are invisible until someone steps outside them. The historical institutions in South Korea were eventually dismantled, but the social forces that enabled them, fear of disorder, economic urgency, and the dehumanization of the vulnerable did not disappear. They simply evolved. What Squid Game ultimately exposes is not a secret history, but a familiar pattern. When human worth is measured by output and failure is treated as personal fault, systems become indifferent to suffering. Not because they are designed to harm, but because harm becomes an acceptable byproduct. This is why reducing Squid Game to shock value misses its significance. The violence in the show is exaggerated, but the underlying question is restrained and precise. How far will a system go when survival is conditional? The real lesson does not lie in comparing fictional scenes to real places. It lies in recognizing how easily language like welfare, opportunity, or choice can mask coercion when alternatives are absent. Understanding this history does not mean rejecting progress or economic growth. It means acknowledging that development without safeguards creates blind spots, and that those blind spots often contain people. Squid Game is not a documentary. It does not claim to be, but it functions as a lens, one that brings past and present into focus at the same time, and perhaps that is why it unsettles, because it suggests that the most dangerous systems are not hidden on remote islands, but embedded in everyday life, normalized, justified, and rarely questioned. The story does not end with the show. It continues wherever inequality is treated as inevitable,